Did you know that many of the things we take for granted about the Christian faith are actually not written in the Bible? For centuries, traditions, legends, and human interpretations have mixed with the scriptures to the point that we no longer know how to distinguish what is biblical and what is not. Today, we are going to discover 7 myths that practically all Christians believe, but that surprisingly don't appear anywhere in the Word of God. Prepare yourself for a revelation that can change your perspective forever. The 3 wise men. C. A beautiful but invented tradition. Every Christmas, millions of people around the world represent the arrival of 3 wise men to the manger where Jesus was born. Melchior, Gaspar, and Balthazar have become such familiar characters that it's almost impossible to imagine Christmas without them. But here comes the surprise that's going to leave you with your mouth open. The Bible never says there were 3. It also doesn't say they were kings, and much less does it mention their names. Let's go to the original text in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. There it clearly says that wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. The Greek word used is Magi, which refers to wise men, astrologers, or Persian priests who studied the stars. No kings anywhere. And why do we think there were 3? Very simple, because they brought 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But bringing 3 gifts doesn't mean there were 3 people. Imagine you arrive at a birthday party with 3 gifts for the birthday person. Does that mean you are 3 people? Of course not. The tradition of the 3 wise men developed several centuries after Christ. The names Melchior, Gaspar, and Balthazar appear for the first time in 6th century texts, more than 500 years after Jesus' birth. The early church didn't know these names because they simply didn't exist in the scriptures. Moreover, some ancient non-biblical texts speak of up to 12 wise men who came to worship the baby Jesus. Others mention 2, others 4. The number 3 was established as tradition, but has no biblical foundation whatsoever. What the Bible does tell us is that these wise men followed an extraordinary star from their lands until they found the child. That they brought costly gifts that had prophetic meaning. The gold represented Christ's royalty, the frankincense his divinity, and the myrrh his future death and burial. But the image of 3 kings mounted on camels, with golden crowns and luxurious tunics, is pure human tradition that has mixed with the original biblical narrative. The apple of Eden, the fruit that was never mentioned. If we asked 100 people what fruit Adam and Eve ate in the Garden of Eden, 99 would answer without hesitation: an apple. This image is so engraved in our minds that it's practically impossible to think of anything else. But here comes another revelation that's going to surprise you. The Bible never, ever, at any moment, mentions that it was an apple. Let's go to Genesis chapter 3, verse 6, where the moment of the fall is narrated. The Hebrew text speaks of pri, which simply means fruit. It doesn't specify what type of fruit it was. It could have been a pear, a peach, a pomegranate, a fig, or any other fruit that existed in that perfect garden. So, where did the idea of the apple come from? The answer takes us to a play on words in Latin that changed history forever. When St. Jerome translated the Bible into Latin in the 4th century, in what is known as the Vulgate, he used the word malum to refer to the forbidden fruit. But here's the fascinating detail. Malum in Latin means both evil and apple. It was the same word for both concepts. The artists and preachers of the Middle Ages fell in love with this play on words. It was perfect for their sermons and paintings. The fruit of evil that phonetically resembled the apple, and thus, for centuries, the apple became the visual symbol of original sin. But serious biblical scholars have pointed out that in the Middle East, where the Garden of Eden was located, apples were not common fruits. The climate was not conducive to them. It was more likely to be a fig, a pomegranate, or some tropical fruit we no longer know. Some researchers even suggest it could have been a pomegranate, since this fruit was a symbol of fertility in the ancient cultures of that region. Others propose it could have been a fig, considering that Adam and Eve covered themselves with fig leaves after eating the forbidden fruit, according to Genesis 3, verse 7. The truth is, that the Bible remains silent about the specific identity of the fruit, and perhaps it's intentional. Perhaps God didn't want us to focus on what type of fruit it was, but on the act of disobedience itself. Lucifer, see, a name the Bible never used for Satan. Lucifer. Just mentioning that name evokes images of the fallen angel, of the devil, of God's enemy who was expelled from heaven for his rebellion. Practically all Christians associate this name with Satan. But prepare yourself for another surprise that's going to shake your theological foundations. The Bible never uses the name Lucifer to refer to Satan. Let's examine the only place where this word appears in some biblical translations. Isaiah chapter 14, verse 12. In the Reina Valera version it says, "How you have fallen from heaven, O morning star, son of the dawn." But here's the problem. The original Hebrew text doesn't say Lucifer. The Hebrew word that appears there is Helel, which means bright or shining. It refers to the planet Venus, which the ancients called the morning star, because it was visible just before dawn. So where did Lucifer come from? Once again, from St. Jerome's Latin translation. He translated Helel as Lucifer, which in Latin means light-bearer, or the one who brings light. It was simply a poetic description of the planet Venus, not a proper name. But here comes the most shocking part. If you read all of chapter 14 of Isaiah in context, you realize it's not talking about the devil at all. It's talking about the king of Babylon. The prophet Isaiah is using a metaphor. He compares the fall of the powerful Babylonian king with the fall of the morning star from heaven. It's poetic language to describe how a proud and arrogant king would be humbled and destroyed. Notice verse 4 of the same chapter. "You will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon." Isaiah is being very clear about who is the subject of his prophecy. The early Christians never interpreted this passage as a reference to Satan. That interpretation developed centuries later, when medieval theologians began to apply this text allegorically to the devil. The most curious thing is that the Bible does have specific names for God's enemy. It calls him Satan, which means adversary in Hebrew. It calls him devil, from the Greek diabolos, which means slanderer. It calls him the ancient serpent, the dragon, the evil one, but it never calls him Lucifer. Even the famous passage in Luke chapter 10, verse 18, where Jesus says, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven," doesn't use the name Lucifer. Jesus clearly says, Satan. This confusion has generated an entire mythology around the name Lucifer that simply has no biblical foundation. It's another example of how later theological traditions have mixed with the original scriptures. Angels with wings, NZD, celestial creatures without feathers. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine an angel. What do you see? Probably a beautiful figure, dressed in white, with enormous white wings extended behind their back. This image is so rooted in our culture that it's impossible to think of angels without wings. But here comes another revelation that's going to change your perspective forever. The Bible almost never describes angels with wings. Let's review the most famous angelic appearances in the scriptures. In Genesis chapter 18, 3 angels visit Abraham. How does the text describe them? As men who walked along the road. Abraham didn't realize they were angels until after. If they had had enormous wings, don't you think he would have noticed immediately? In Genesis chapter 19, 2 angels arrive in Sodom to rescue Lot. Again, the text describes them as men. Lot invites them to his house as if they were normal travelers. The inhabitants of Sodom see them as ordinary men. No mention of wings anywhere. In the book of Judges chapter 6, an angel appears to Gideon. Gideon converses with him for a long while without realizing he's a celestial being. Only at the end, when the angel disappears supernaturally, does Gideon understand who he had been talking to. In the New Testament, the angels who announce Jesus' birth to the shepherds are also not described with wings. Luke chapter 2 simply says that an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them. So where does the image of angels with wings come from? The answer takes us to early Christian art and a fascinating mixture of cultural influences. The first Christian artists were inspired by Greco-Roman representations of the goddess Victory, who did have wings. They also took elements from the winged creatures of ancient mythology, the Nordic Valkyries, the Persian winged genies, and the winged figures of Egyptian iconography. It's true that the Bible mentions some celestial creatures with wings, but they're not common angels. They're special beings with specific names, the seraphim in Isaiah chapter 6 verse 2, who have 6 wings, the cherubim that appear in Ezekiel chapter 1, with 4 wings and 4 different faces. But these seraphim and cherubim are special categories of celestial beings, not the messenger angels who normally interact with humans. The word angel in Greek is angelos, which simply means messenger. It doesn't necessarily imply they have wings. Biblical angels were sent by God to carry messages, and their appearance was human enough that people could mistake them for ordinary travelers. Mary Magdalene, the woman who was never a prostitute. Mary Magdalene is one of the most fascinating figures in the New Testament, but also one of the most misunderstood. For centuries, Christian tradition has presented her as a repentant prostitute who found redemption in Jesus. This image has inspired countless works of art, novels, and films. But here comes a revelation that's going to change everything you thought you knew about this extraordinary woman. The Bible never says Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. Let's examine each mention of Mary Magdalene in the Gospels. Luke chapter 8 verse 2 gives us the first description. And also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases, Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. Notice carefully, it says she had 7 demons, not that she was a prostitute. Demons in the biblical context were associated with illnesses, mental or spiritual disorders, not necessarily with sexual immorality. Mary Magdalene appears in all 4 Gospels as one of the women who followed Jesus and supported him financially. Luke chapter 8, verse 3, mentions that these women were helping to support them out of their own means. This suggests Mary had her own financial resources, something unusual for a woman in that era. In the crucifixion accounts, Mary Magdalene is present at the foot of the cross, along with other faithful women. In the resurrection, she's the first person to whom Jesus appears according to Mark chapter 16, verse 9, and John chapter 20, verses 11 through 18. So, where did the idea that she was a prostitute come from? From a confusion that was perpetuated for centuries. In the 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great gave a sermon where he identified Mary Magdalene with the sinful woman who anointed Jesus' feet in Luke chapter 7, verses 36 through 50. He also identified her with Mary of Bethany, Lazarus' sister, who anointed Jesus in John chapter 12. But if you read these passages carefully, you realize they're 3 different women in different situations. The sinful woman in Luke 7 has no name. Mary of Bethany is clearly identified as the sister of Lazarus and Martha, and Mary Magdalene is presented as a woman from whom 7 demons had come out. Modern biblical scholars have demonstrated there's no textual basis for confusing these 3 women. It was later traditions that mixed them, creating a composite figure that doesn't correspond to any of the 3. Moreover, if you analyze Mary Magdalene's behavior in the Gospels, everything indicates she was a woman of respectable social position. She had resources to financially support Jesus' ministry. She had direct access to Christ's tomb. Her testimony was taken seriously by the apostles. In that culture, a prostitute's testimony wouldn't have had legal or social credibility. However, Mary Magdalene is presented as the principal witness of the resurrection, the most important event in Christianity. December 25th, a Christianized pagan date. Every December 25th, millions of Christians around the world celebrate the birth of Jesus Christ. Families gather, exchange gifts, and commemorate the arrival of the Savior to the world. It's one of the most important celebrations in the Christian calendar. But here comes a historical truth that very few know, and that's going to surprise you deeply. Jesus was not born on December 25th. The Bible doesn't mention the exact date of Christ's birth. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke narrate the events of the birth, but neither specifies the day, month, or even the season of the year. Even more fascinating, the early Christians didn't celebrate Jesus' birth. During the first 3 centuries of Christianity, the most important date was Easter, which commemorated Christ's death and resurrection. The birth wasn't considered a special celebration date, so why was December 25th chosen? The answer takes us to one of the shrewdest political decisions in Christianity's history. In the 4th century, the Roman Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity with the Edict of Milan in the year 313. But the Roman Empire remained predominantly pagan, with millions of citizens who worshipped various gods. December 25th was a sacred date in the Roman world. It was the day of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, a solar deity that had gained popularity throughout the empire. It also coincided with the festivities of the Persian god Mithras, highly venerated by Roman soldiers. These winter solstice celebrations were deeply rooted in Roman culture. They were days of celebration, banquets, and gift exchange. The people eagerly awaited these celebrations each year. The Christian leaders of the 4th century faced a practical dilemma: how to convert an entire empire without creating a cultural revolution. The solution was brilliant: adapt the existing pagan dates and give them Christian meaning. In the year 336, Pope Julius I officially declared that December 25th would be the celebration date of Christ's birth. Not because there was biblical evidence that Jesus was born that day, but because it was strategically convenient. The biblical evidence even suggests Jesus couldn't have been born in December. Luke chapter 2, verse 8, mentions that there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. In Israel, shepherds didn't keep their flocks in the field during winter due to cold and rain. Additionally, Luke chapter 2, verse 1, mentions that Joseph and Mary traveled to Bethlehem for a census ordered by the Roman emperor. Censuses weren't conducted in winter due to travel difficulties. Many biblical scholars suggest Jesus was probably born in spring or early fall, based on chronological clues from the Gospels. The crown of thorns, a detail that may surprise you. Jesus' crucifixion is the central event of Christianity, and one of the most moving details of that terrible experience is the crown of thorns that the Roman soldiers placed on his head. This image has inspired countless works of art, hymns, and meditations for 2,000 years. But there's an aspect of this crown that very few know, and that can completely change your perspective on this symbol of suffering. When we think of the crown of thorns, we immediately imagine sharp thorns piercing Jesus' forehead, causing pain and making blood flow all over his face. But biblical scholars have discovered something fascinating about the type of plant the Roman soldiers probably used. The Greek word used in the Gospels is akanthinos, which refers to thorny plants in general. But botanists who have studied Jerusalem's flora in the 1st century have identified the most likely plant, the Ziziphus spina Christi, known as Christ's thorn. The surprising thing about this plant is that its thorns aren't like those we normally imagine. They're curved, like small hooks, designed by nature to cling and not to pierce. This means the crown wouldn't have caused deep puncture wounds, but constant and tearing pain. But there's something even more revealing in this apparently minor detail. The Roman soldiers didn't put the crown of thorns to add physical suffering to the crucifixion. They already had much more effective methods to cause pain. The crown was an act of mockery, a cruel parody of royalty. Mark chapter 15, verses 17 through 19, describes the scene. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. The soldiers were representing a grotesque coronation. The purple tunic imitated royal robes. The crown of thorns parodied golden crowns. The mocking reverences imitated imperial court protocol. But here's the divine irony the soldiers couldn't imagine. Without knowing it, they were proclaiming a profound truth. Jesus really was a king, but his kingdom was not of this world, as he himself had told Pilate in John chapter 18, verse 36. The crown of thorns thus becomes a powerful symbol of the inversion of values in God's kingdom. While earthly kings wore golden crowns obtained through conquest and bloodshed, the King of the universe wore a crown of thorns, suffering voluntarily for humanity's salvation. There's a later tradition that says the crown of thorns was preserved and is currently found in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, but serious historians doubt the authenticity of this relic, which appeared in historical records several centuries after the crucifixion. Limbo, a place invented by tradition. For centuries, millions of Catholics have believed in the existence of limbo, that mysterious place where supposedly go the souls of babies who die without baptism. This doctrine has consoled grieving parents and generated intense theological debates. Mothers have wept thinking their unbaptized children are in a place of eternal waiting, neither in heaven nor hell. But here comes a revelation that's going to surprise many sincere believers. Limbo doesn't exist in the Bible. You can read the Old and New Testament from beginning to end, and you won't find a single mention of this place. The word limbo doesn't even appear in the scriptures. It's a later theological invention that developed gradually through the centuries. The idea of limbo arose in the 13th century when medieval theologians faced an anguishing question: what happens to babies who die before being baptized? According to the doctrine of original sin, we're all born with the stain of Adam's sin. According to the teaching about baptism, this sacrament is necessary for salvation. But is it just for God to condemn to hell innocent babies who never had the opportunity to sin consciously? To resolve this apparent contradiction, theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas proposed the existence of limbo. It would be a place of natural happiness, but without the beatific vision of God that characterizes heaven. Unbaptized babies would be there in a state of natural happiness, but couldn't access God's direct presence. But this theological solution created more problems than it solved. If limbo is a place of happiness, why then is baptism important? If babies are fine in limbo, wouldn't it be better if they died before having the opportunity to sin and be condemned? The Bible presents a very different vision of God's mercy and justice. Jesus himself showed special love for children. In Matthew chapter 19, verse 14, he says, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." In Mark chapter 10, verse 14, Jesus was indignant when the disciples wanted to keep children away from him. "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these." These passages suggest children have a special relationship with God's kingdom, not that they're excluded from it for lack of baptism. King David, when he lost his baby son, expressed confidence he would see him again. In 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 23, David says, "But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." David had hope of a future reunion with his son. It's fascinating that in the year 2006, the International Theological Commission of the Vatican, with the approval of Pope Benedict XVI, published a document titled "The Hope of Salvation for Infants Who Die Without Being Baptized." In this document, they recognized that the theory of limbo was never official, church dogma, and express hope that God, in His mercy, provides salvation for these children,